The Dynasties of England. This dynasty is known as the Tudors. Now, the Tudors are an interesting one because they do descend from the Plantagenet dynasty on both sides. But the side that's most famous, the one of the ruling monarch, was debarred from the throne. This is due to the royal bloodline that they claim comes from an individual called John of Gaunt, who had them, this dynastic line, out of wedlock and then subsequently had them legitimised. They were legitimised, and the Tudors, or the male line of the Tudors at the very least, descends from this bloodline, but one of the rules of their legitimacy was that they were debarred from the throne. So technically speaking, when Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII, took the throne of England, by blood, he, technically speaking, shouldn't have the throne. But he also gained the throne not just because of blood, but by the rule of conquest. He won the Battle of Bosworth Fields, and he killed Richard III. So, much like William the Conqueror, he earned England via conquest. But he needed to make sure that his bloodline wasn't challenged. So as a result, one of the first things King Henry VII did was he united the thrones of Lancaster and York to create the infamous Tudor, which he symbolised with the infamous Tudor rose, which is still the national flower of England to this day. This unification was done via his marriage to Elizabeth of York, who was the oldest child of King Edward IV, a direct Plantagenet, and although had technically speaking been declared illegitimate by Richard III, so that Richard III could take the throne, technically speaking was legitimate. The Tudor dynasty, interestingly enough, is only a dynasty of 3 generations, much like the Danes. However, it is more famously known. It has very interesting characters, and very famous ones, much like the most infamous King Henry VIII. The dynasty comprised of King Henry VII, his son King Henry VIII, and all 3 of Henry's children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. But the dynasty ended when the Virgin Queen herself, Elizabeth I, chose to not marry nor have any children. Knowing that the Tudor dynasty would end, people wondered who the next dynasty would be. You see, King Henry VIII had written the 3rd Act of Succession, where he decreed who would take the throne and who had precedent. Technically speaking, by this Act of Succession, the throne should pass via his younger sister and not his older sister. Henry had 2 sisters, Margaret, the older, who married into the Scottish bloodline and the Scottish royal family, and the younger sister, Mary, who herself only had 1 surviving female daughter, and this female daughter subsequently only had 3 daughters herself. However, Mary's bloodline had caused many issues of contention over the years, and Elizabeth had many issues with them. So, in some ways, it is no surprise that she chose instead to unite England and Scotland together by making the descendant of Margaret Tudor the new heir to the throne. This changed the dynasty from Tudor to Stuart. Now, the Stuart bloodline is an interesting one, and in some ways is a dynasty that then gets complicated. They are notoriously fraught with bad luck, and unfortunately when they took the throne of England, that bad luck still followed them. The Stuarts have 2 parts in their dynasty. They lost the throne, much like the Anglo-Saxons in the past did. You start off with James I and Charles I, and you think everything's smooth sailing. However, religion gets in the way, alongside politics. Under the reign of Charles I, who was Catholic, unlike his father James, who was Protestant, you had many clashes with Parliament. These clashes ended with the English Civil War, one of the largest wars of conflict in England between different factions. And this civil war famously ended kinda similarly to the French Revolution, where the King of England had his head chopped off. Though the English Civil War happened centuries before the French Revolution. As a result, for a number of years, you had no monarchy, and there was no plans on restoring the monarchy. You would think in some ways this was the end. However, as history would tell us, it was not the case. The government of England decided to grant a different head of state title, the Lord Protector, which they gave to Oliver Cromwell, who was the head of the parliamentary faction against Charles I. So technically speaking, although a Lord Protector and not a monarch, Oliver Cromwell did become near enough the next best thing, and so we can classify him as a new dynasty. Oliver Cromwell reigned until his death, and then named his son Richard as his heir. Though technically speaking, he could have named any individual as his heir. He, much like Napoleon as a different dictator, instead chose to try and make himself his own dynastic line. Richard Cromwell, however, did not go down well with Parliament, and he didn't reign for very long, only a simple 247 days before he was forcibly removed from the throne of England, or the near enough throne of England. This meant that England once again had a lack of a single head of state, which doesn't very much bode well for England. England, as a result, suffered a year of almost anarchy until they decided that the best way to return the head of state was to formally restore the monarchy, which they did, although they had certain concessions which affected the Stuart bloodline. This restoration of the monarchy brought back Charles II, a member of the Stuart dynasty and son of Charles I. He is famously also known as the King of Party. One of the stipulations that occurred due to the restoration of the monarchy was that the monarch had to be Anglican or Protestant. Protestant had converted to the phrase of Anglican, so we will follow with Anglican from now on. If a royal was Catholic, they would be debarred from the throne of England. This was due to the fact that the monarch was the head of the Anglican Church, along with being the head of state. And this rule is still in place to this day. If any of the current royal family were to become Catholic, they would be debarred from the throne of England. This debarment caused issues with the Stuart dynasty, and in some ways led to its end. Charles II honoured the wishes of the government, and remained Anglican until his deathbed, which is when he converted to Catholicism, though the king was on his deathbed with only hours left to live, so in some ways it wasn't the end of the world. Charles II, however, had no children, and so passed the throne over to his brother James II. James II was Anglican. However, much like Charles II, he suffered with influences of individuals in the royal family who were Catholic. one of the most famous of all being both Charles II and James II's mother, Henrietta of France, who had persuaded her own husband, Charles I, to convert to Catholicism. James II, as an Anglican, however, did marry an Anglican woman as his first wife, a lady named Anne Hyde, with whom they had 2 daughters. Both of these daughters were also raised Anglican. James II, however, did take a second wife after his first passed away, and this second wife was Catholic. James II had a son via his second wife, who naturally would be his heir. However, this is where things get a bit complicated. One day, James II decided to convert from Anglican to Catholicism, and had decided that he would raise his son Catholic. This caused issues with Parliament, and threatened a second English Civil War, and in some ways could have ended to the end of the Stuart dynasty. But James II had one saving grace to keep the Stuart dynasty alive, that being his 2 adult daughters. Parliament chose to debar James II from the throne of England, and chose as well to ban the son of James II and his bloodline via his son, all of which who were Catholic, from the throne of England. They are famously known as the Jacobites due to their rebellion to try and take back the throne. The Stuart dynasty swiftly changed to that of the daughters of James II. Queen Mary, along with her husband William of Orange, who jointly ruled, and subsequently on William's death, passed then on to Queen Anne. Unfortunately, though, these 2 women suffered the same issue that a lot of the Stuart dynasty had, which was of conceiving a child that survived to adulthood. Both queens were unsuccessful, and as a result the dynasty ended with a lack of offspring. So the Stuart dynasty that ruled England ended after the death of Queen Anne, although subsequently there were a few Jacobite individuals still alive, but they were debarred from the throne because they were Catholic. So as a result, England had to look for a new dynasty. And how did they do that? Well, they did it by going back in time. Having the criteria of the individuals could not be Catholic, and they had to descend in some way back to William the Conqueror, and preferably via the Stuarts, they started looking, going all the way back to the beginning of the Stuart dynasty of King James I and his children. King James I had multiple children, not just including Charles I. One of them was a daughter, and this daughter married into the bloodline that became the House of Hanover. This then led to an individual called Sophia of Hanover being declared heiress by the Act of Settlement in 1701, before Queen Anne passed away. Sophia, however, did not become the next Queen of England after Anne's death, because she passed away 2 months before Queen Anne herself. But Sophia had children. Specifically, she had a son, who became the first Hanoverian King of England. As such, we have our next dynasty, the House of Hanover. This dynasty contains a period of history of England that is quite famously known as the Georgian period. And this is due to the fact that the first 4 kings of the dynasty of the House of Hanover were all named George. This dynasty ruled England quite peacefully, There was no challenges to their blood claim, nothing like had come before. However, their dynasty had issues internally anyway, more on illnesses and madness than on conflicts. One of the most famous individuals of the House of Hanover is King George III. He's quite commonly known as the Mad King, although he was suffering from some form of health issue, one that is still debated about by historians today. King George III had multiple children, 14 in total. However, from these 14, very few children were born. This was due to multiple reasons, one of which was a princess known as Princess Charlotte, born from George III's heir apparent, the future King George IV. But Princess Charlotte passed away before she could take the throne of England, although she would be a dynastic change. Subsequently, George IV's younger brother did successfully manage to have a child, who became the last heir and last monarch of the dynasty of Hanover, because she herself was also a queen. This, of course, is the infamous Queen Victoria. Now, one thing that is quite interesting is that should Charlotte or Victoria have taken the throne, both of them married individuals of the same household. So, subsequently, if history had gone either way, you still would have got the next dynasty. This next dynasty was the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and is an interesting one to discuss. Technically speaking, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha ran concurrently until the reign of Elizabeth II, when naturally it should have changed once more, as it has happened previously. The law was still the same. The dynasty change usually occurred when a female took the throne and took the name of her husband as she entered into his house. But that is not the case, because as anyone would know if they were asking, we don't talk about the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha when we refer to the current royal family. And here is where we get to the very complicated part, because the name Saxe-Coburg and Gotha went out of fashion in the 1900s, specifically when the Great War, also known as the First World War, began. The First World War was a very trying time for monarchies. It ended with many dynasties falling, such as the German, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Tsar, and many, many others. The English monarchy was also in quite a few trying times, or more specifically suspicions, due to the name Saxe-Coburg and Gotha being both a German surname and a territory in Germany, which was highlighted very often by the media, and caused quite a bit of doubt within the English population. King George V, who was currently on the throne, realised that this caused an issue, and needed to fix it. So what did he choose to do, besides rechristen his own dynasty bloodline? He removed the name Saxe-Coburg and Gotha and rechristened the dynasty as the House of Windsor, which came into effect in 1917. To this day, the House of Windsor is a phrase still commonly used, and is technically speaking the dynastic name of the house. The only additions to the dynastic name occurred with the marriage of Queen Elizabeth II. Queen Elizabeth II wanted to take the name of her husband, and it was decided by Parliament that this would be allowed with a double barrel, a joint union of the name of her husband and the surname of herself. So technically speaking, the dynasty today is the dynasty of Mountbatten-Windsor. Now, the bit that is interesting is because the House of Windsor came about not due to a dynastic change, but due to the laws of government, there is speculation that should, when the next Queen of England sit on the throne, the house name would not change. And if it did change in any way, it might only change the same way as it did for Queen Elizabeth, with the addition of a double barrel. So as a result, although the dynasty technically changed with the turn of Queen Elizabeth II, the dynasty has also not changed, hence the cause for confusion. However, we may not know the answer to whether or not this dynasty will change from the House of Windsor, due to the fact that King Charles III's next two heirs are both boys. So it could be a great many years before that debate even comes about, whether Mountbatten will be dropped and a different double barrel will be added onto the Windsor, or whether it will change completely and the name Windsor will no longer be retained. Either way, it is interesting, because technically speaking, although as per history it should have been a dynasty change, the House of Windsor is still classified the same and part of the same dynasty, now with King Charles III, as it did the same with his ancestor King George V, who changed it over. So in modern day we don't classify it as a dynasty change. Whether history will choose otherwise is a different matter. Thank you for watching, and I do apologise if in any form or way I have made you more confused. But as we will learn, dynasties aren't always the most straightforward. I'd be interested to know in the comments down below if any one of you had picked up any references for both, especially the fictional references of both Harry Potter and A Song of Ice and Fire. And I hope I will see you all in the next video.